This is Synopsis, page 2 of 2, the agenda, to continue explanation, A. Evident extensions and a Nephi-limbic, Muslimbic proxy association, as systematic and exponential radicalism, VIO modeling, and Russian doll, museum mannequin, android affiliation, reminiscent relevance to what story depicting what was referred to as the expressionless, and a tragic circumstances of confusion and disorientation yet of a psychopathic God, HUD, contrived and obsessive engineered compulsion of handicapped materialistic proprietorship, possession and wanting more and more and more, whilst pressured as retarded hypomanic perverted nonsense nuisance. Clearly evident of corporate domineering, especially comparative to the privatization of incarceration, of the examples of GEO Corporation, and judiciary sacrilege, denoting multiple life sentences, and especially exposed of the cult leader of Scientology, David Miscavige, exposed as a grotesque savage, whom solicited slavery against victims, purportedly performed as creationist blasphemy of 1 billion-year contracts, as imprisonment, servitude and eternal damnation, nethers and ethers of imaginal lands and resources as schizoid infiltrations and tragic circumstances, combined of assertions of adverse possessive and external imposed stoking of membrane custodian sycophant amalgamation, disharmony and dysfunction, and exsumption and enslavement, not limited to computational algorithms, server-emulated hard drive integrations and phantom zombie pseudo-science fiction satire emissions of film character realisms of fictional transfusion, as weaponism of malware parasitism and enforced hosting upon brain flesh and bodily anatomy. The film membranes of 3D printing video scripting, brains and bodies of emphasis to escapism from penitentiaries, such as Guantanamo Bay, as holiday camps and enigmatic association of video game slang terminology such as camping, integrated as a victimization of brains and bodies external to such initiations of penitentiaries, cells, whilst memory dumping, temporal metascanned, metamorphed, cybertronic programming, and pseudo-avatar, natures, projected as central access to decentralized of brain and neural synaptic, thoughts and feelings, and thus emission of megalomaniac assertion of adverse to exponential cloning and emulated possession threats, comparative to patterns of cell division and renewal. Splicing segmentation, compartmentalization, partitions of botnet, BIOS gigabyte, memory, Wi-Fi coalescence and catalyst modeling, as munitions, emitted of manual inputs, and automated miming brain senses, thoughts and feelings and persona, simultaneous peer-pressured, persona cloning, printing and stem cell, subatomic particle, patternism of pendulums, as constituents and elementary centralized modes of macro and micro importance, as templated stencils imposed as legitimacy dominance, whilst projected bioenergetic, intermediaries afflicted as bionic neural malware, character assassination and decapitation via imprinting, filters of persona cloner incidents, as modes of domination and bondage, cultic and gang, hive-minded hybridism and vampirism, warring strife, of territory, resources and drugs as cardinals of myopic-induced, drone, droid, and disconnected from reality, derivative spectral, and telegraphic, teleprompted, eyeball imagery and eardrum prosthetics and acoustics via biotech prosthetic interfacing, acclimatized of disembodied and detached rehearsed, scryers of brains and synapses, and biology of organs, blood, bone, marrow, DNA, fluids, and skin and masonry, and molecules and genus maps. Whilst neuroconditioned, via catalyst aspect depictions, organic memory and parsing through polarized prisms, of templated memory and measurements, example of video game and film characterization, and bodycam emulation, whilst the affection to such video games, performed esoterically as consortment and regimental conformism elicitations, hence metric imposures, accelerated of photographic memory. Interfacing, and thus threatened as catatonia, pausing and integrated invitations of paralyses and subsequently escalated to and as disconnection from reality, acclimated of severely compromised, sadistic, insidious, sordid, narcissist, psychopathic, sociopathic and junkism constraints, programmed as draconian, lords and fellows and politicking hegemonic dualism proxies as colleagues of personnel. Carriers and public to private server, emissions of in-own Wi-Fi bubble verses and storylines of crucifixion, sacrificial chambers, and fiat commercial productions, emphasized of Microsoft shadow drives of copies and snapshot shadowing what eluded as original blueprints, and Activision Corporation battle.nets, and elitist Egyptsy diaspora, neural imprinted, rabies, Ebola, swine flu, bubonic plague and HIV. As example, of New World neurons, and seduced clerics, rabbis, shahs and cardinals and popes, nuns, priests and monks, as spokes and spoofs, of homicidal hybrid and picturesque cannibalistic, shark belly, Mayan and Aztec, Hispanic, Latino, Arabic and brown ethnicity, formulations of bioenergetic shells of tattooings of skin as hollow shell membranes, whilst acoustic assertions of enigmatic prophecy, dictated adherence, and megalomanic perverted detached, disembodied examples of endomorphs as strains of bionic, molecular and macro COSM alphaism and posturing, according to size and stature, hence a cellulite, particle excretions and macro COSM lensing and gyroscopic exotic prisons, projected as exaggerated, eating disorders, via thought form macro scripted dissonance of torturous remembrance cues as mnemonically emitted, button impressioning, and privilege polarization as belief. Hence the interfacing and impressioning tactics of screening integrations, and crystal brain ball gazing and 8-ball predictional destiny narratives as storylines of multisensory, neuromorphic and polarized memory. A pseudonym, emissions, of triggering and priming, hypnotics via infrared, infrasound and ultrasound. Fixations against brains and neurology and senses, as LED laser precisions, and social engineering gestated as individual to community, hybridized neuroprogramming, parameters, and integrated encryption software, splicing digital analog delusional constants as automated obliteration, whilst dictations of murderous marauding mafia, and darknet hits, as perpetrators alluded to hiding in and working through what depicted as mechanical hardware and biomechanical printings. As arrogant obnoxious authoritarian bullies, semi-detachment, file conversion threats, semi-murdered victims, and literal depictions of dickheads and dick-measuring contests, whilst pseudo-formations of military life and civilian life patterns of pendulums, as fanciful erroneous, grandiose seduction of power over others. Via computer-screened, prosthetic imprinting upon brain flesh, neurology and synapses, whilst alluded to playing, drunkard and drugging personification as video games against life, imposed then after as watchers of what depicted as visions, telegraphic, telekinetic, teleprompter, telecommunication of membranes, whilst crisis acting acclamations of replacement and displacement, and pseudo formations of blindness, deaf and dumb and dostling, escalated as alternate reality synthesis, and assertions of meta-recorded synthetic memory, extremophile, qubit particles of video pixels, media and film and plasticine toys, temporal membranes, and chakra bubbles of concentrated pseudonym embodiments and surgical rigid, static bionic solidity, what is relevant to rigor mortis and cryochambers, and absolute zero. Whilst modes of hiding and evasion, via exotic physics, chemistry and video game databases of geographic planes, as snapshot photographic Hertz signal partitioning, medical holographing, intended as adverse possession, whilst dictated as proxy pseudoscience, pseudonym metamorphism, homicidal dementia and autism and Down syndromes, combinations of rapturous and raunchy exaggerated, homicidal sexualized behaviorism and endomorphic association as afterlife and after-death myriads, as infatuation and promises, whilst simultaneously performed as modes of ambushing and entrapment, upon brain as coagulated biomechanical forms as photographic metas of micro, black, hole, and pressure densities and nanotech formulas. An example of such complicit conformist victims are the older gamers and guilds of groupings, inclusive of the religiously indoctrinated, delusional folie à deux, emitted through projected groupings of guilds of video game enfranchisement, biology amputation and photographic memory stimulants, remote augments to local projection and acoustic emissions concentrated of all the homicidally induced conformist victims, incited as handicap deranged, website cookie scripted consent, submissions and accepts and rejects, as pseudonym adverse possessive assumption, asserted as one brain, monotheistic oneness, gun of thought form perverted lunacy mutilation, concentrated activations and dormancy sleeper cellular macrosifted mind, speakers, masqueraded as imaginal and photometric components of decentralization and filtering threats, reimposed as mass possession and neural truncation, and exponential formations of egotistical splurging, against what depicted as unibinary patterns of pendulum versus of heads-up displays, as ego dominion, sorting processes against actual existence, as interdiction, interloping, intermissions and intergalactic existence imperial, colonization eternal. Exponential warring confliction, incited as decentralized internet and feral federal and prim and proper, reserves of banks of neuron transmitter, pseudo-fiat currencies incited as neurons, and synthetic robberies as cellular filtrations, an example of the film movie, Pulp Fiction and Hannibal Lecter and Interview with the Vampire and Wolf and Gods of Egypt, films as CGI hybridization, and microchipped circuits of snakes and ladders, Dungeons and Dragons and checkers and chess, Deep Blue and Jaguar supercomputer, conduits as derivatives of bionic cloud computations as manufacturing, automated grids against organic brain flesh and neurology, as requests and permissions of thought and feelings, and integrated spy mastering, and puppetry echelons of degrees, of hypomanic egotism, through, upon and via senses, masqueraded as permissions and retractions of oppress ions and compliance, congealing neuroprogramming, acoustic desecration and sacrilege, fixated as a many to one by one concentrated obliteration against one organism, concentrated against with all of that combined, simultaneously. Whilst blamed for all that, as modes of exponential degradation, and weaponization of all the hypocrisy that has been metamapped. Committed as broken promises and false gift-stooping tactics for as long as possible, whilst infestation shot at one innocent man, with abominable pestilence, conducted of dreamscape schematic, fractal and blackish brackish lobotomized insanity and satire extremist, idiotic hybrid, Frankenstein junkie semi-cadavers shadow entity generics, elicitated as God, HUDs, and junkie. Paradises as gruesome egotism, raunchy assertions and generic pseudo, archetypes of blame and handicap dominance, custodianship and bondage, whilst cannibalism incited as adrenal chrome enzyme highs as personal underground caves masqueraded as hells and heavens of pathetic puny weakling emittents of cowardice charlatans, shooting acoustic emissions of virtual, astral death threats for being exposed and known about. As the spectral maps performed as soul, spirit and invisibility, dark net, synthesized fiber optic humanoid shark brain and cryptid, and crude oil, cellular prism emitted, electrolyte, neural synaptic robotic, intermission, threatened to waking people up as monsters, threatened as eternal imprisonment. This concludes Synopsis 2 of 2, the agenda. Thank you for listening, and please share about this.